In April of 2022, there was a minor stir caused by a Tucker Carlson program about men shining red light on their balls. This was part of a trailer for a program called The End of Men, which featured a number of men grappling with one another in various stages of undress. This was part of a series of programs called Tucker Carlson Originals, airing on the Fox Nation streaming service. For those unfamiliar, back in 2018, Fox launched the streaming platform primarily for its right-wing audience who regularly watch Fox News. It features exclusive content from a number of right-wing commentators from Fox News, and entertainment from personalities on the right, such as Roseanne Barr and Kelsey Grammer. In February of 2021, Fox signed a deal with Tucker Carlson for exclusive content, including a series of specials called Tucker Carlson Originals. To date, there have been 21 of these specials covering topics ranging from the January 6th attack to hanging out with Kid Rock. I went into depth covering the January 6th three-parter and briefly touched on the Windmill special in the past, but I wanted to dig deeper into this content, so I decided to watch every single episode of Tucker Carlson Originals, including The End of Men. Tucker Carlson Originals are branded as long-form documentaries, and that's coming directly from Tucker Carlson himself.
And so for the last year, we have made a series of long-form documentaries about issues that we think matter to the country and to you.
Tucker Carlson Originals bills itself as the flagship product of Fox Nation.
The Season 2 premiere of Fox Nation's flagship product, Tucker Carlson Originals.
The people watching Fox Nation are, most likely, the most ardent and enthusiastic watchers of Fox News. Looking at the mobile app data, Fox Nation saw large increases in daily users in March and April of 2021, shortly before the debut of Tucker Carlson Today on March 29th, and Tucker Carlson Originals on April 23rd. At the end of its recent fiscal year, it reported an annual increase of 80% in paid subscribers. But the real question is, 80% of what? At one point, Fox Nation was estimated by outside sources to have 1.5 million subscribers, but without an official statement, we can't know what the numbers are for sure. Supposedly, this service is making a difference in their bottom line though. From Fox's third quarter earnings call earlier this year, it was reported, the company has never announced the political streamer's subscriber total since launching in 2018, but Fox did say that the service was instrumental in boosting the company's other revenue to $140 million last quarter from $120 million during the same period in 2021. Fox Nation is built on people so enthralled by Fox News that they're willing to spend a couple of dollars a month just to get access to more content. Tucker Carlson's content is a big part of that, and what they're getting is a more powerful dose of what you would ordinarily see on Tucker Carlson's regular Fox News show. So what does someone see when they tune into Tucker Carlson Originals? While the label of documentary may be debatable, as we'll touch on how many of these programs distort the truth, the long-form label Tucker Carlson gives these programs seems like an outright lie. The vast majority of episodes are about 20 minutes long, and while 3 of the topics run into multiple episodes, the only one that runs longer than an hour is Patriot Purge, and even then, only just barely. Part of the reason I feel comfortable making a video about all of them is that to deep dive into any of the topics he presents is to fundamentally miss the point of these programs. They aren't meant to provide a deep understanding of border security or trans people. They're designed to create feelings of fear, anger, and disgust in the most faithful of Tucker Carlson's audience, and then channel those feelings towards a political end. Many of the episodes feel empty, often opening with overly long trailers for each program. There are lengthy sequences where we watch a man go about his ordinary life in the Maine wilderness, or watch a cow get butchered. Minutes of these programs seem to be just filled up with images designed to elicit emotions in the viewer. And by the way, when I say a cow being butchered, I mean literally being carved up. That's a thing these programs are able to do on a streaming service that wouldn't be allowed on cable TV. There is so much graphic footage that is used throughout these programs. In addition to animals being slaughtered, we see footage of people being attacked or hit by cars. We see surgeries being performed on people. In some cases, you can even see people being murdered right in front of you. Usually this footage is being used to shock the viewer, and often without any sort of explanation. For example, we'll hear Tucker talk about violent crime being on the rise, and then we're cut with random footage of people being assaulted. The specifics of who these people are or what this crime involves doesn't matter. It's a visceral reminder that violent crime is scary, and if you're watching the program, you should be afraid of it. Fear is a common emotion in news media. Some stories are just inherently scary, whether it's an ongoing war or environmental disaster. Big news is often something scary, but most news reporting and most documentaries at least have the pretense of detachment from these emotions, prioritizing informing the audience instead of going for an emotional response. As a point of comparison, let's look at a trailer for a Frontline documentary on January 6th. For those unfamiliar, Frontline is a long-form documentary series on PBS.
And a growing political movement.
They feel like it's what they need to do to politically survive. But they are eating at the foundations of our democracy when they do that.
It's clearly presenting itself as an investigation that attempts to understand the subjects it's talking about through interviews and presenting evidence. In contrast, Tucker Carlson Originals goes in a different direction for its Patriot Purge program. Before looking at it though, there are obvious disagreements on the facts of January 6th. That much is to be expected, and there's room in the world for documentaries to argue about things, even if one of those things is based on a fantasy.
They've begun to fight a new enemy in a new war on terror.
Not Al-Qaeda, white supremacy.
False flags have happened in this country. One of which may have been January 6th.
In the Carlson trailer, the music is more intense. There are more shots of violence, including someone getting killed that I had to censor for YouTube. It also censors the viewer as the target of persecution. This isn't even pretending to play the game of objectivity. It's clearly taken a side and wants to galvanize people on that side to feel intense fear that they are being targeted by the government. This is the style seen throughout each program. Images flash on screen with hard sound beats.
Using violence to intimidate, let's say, members of law enforcement or the judiciary, then you're crossing a line into what we would define as terrorist activity.
Part of the reason these programs are so short is because they never dwell on any part of the story for too long. The audience isn't meant to be learning, they're meant to be feeling. This fear isn't meant to be paralyzing though. Where it is the source of much of the commentary of these programs, they gradually extend upwards with recommendations on how best to deal with that fear. The series is at its most relatable when it presents itself as being on the side of the average person against a big, faceless entity. One example is the episode Green Energy Scams, Maine, which presents the story of an energy corridor being created through a forest in Maine. This would involve cutting down dozens of square miles of trees to install electrical towers to bring energy from hydroelectric dams in Quebec to the people of Maine. The attack on green energy in the title of this program is a small hint that this story isn't everything it's being presented as.
And look at what we're about to do, is destroy that.
The episode spends much of its time talking to activists and regular people in Maine who oppose the corridor, very much framing this as a story of big, evil foreign corporations who have swindled their way into providing energy to Maine.
They threatened the small towns, they hired private investigators, they issued false subpoenas to our notaries in the last referendum campaign. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Unfortunately, the program doesn't go into more detail about any of these points before moving along. Understanding isn't meant to be deep after all. But a little bit of research reveals that this isn't a case of the little guy being crushed by big green energy companies. There are other energy companies in this fight as well. Made Public, a public broadcaster, published an article ahead of a referendum on the corridor, writing, "An economic analysis released by project supporters estimated fossil fuel and nuclear generators could lose $1.8 billion over 15 years if the corridor comes online. Two of those companies with locations in Maine, Calpine and Vistra, have spent heavily opposing the project. But they are just two players in one of the most expensive referendum campaigns in state history." With more than $60 million spent to sway public opinion, there are big energy companies on both sides of this fight, with the people of Maine trapped in the middle. The program also presents the forest as if it were pristine, untouched wilderness.
It's the biggest contiguous forest east of the Mississippi that has yet to be developed.
This simply isn't true. Here's an excerpt from an article on the Bangor Daily News. Although the construction of the corridor would involve substantial tree cutting, the area is not a pristine or untouched forest. It has long been home to commercial logging, and there are hundreds of miles of pre-existing roads. The corridor will certainly affect the landscape. Snowmobilers may see power lines more often, and trees near lines will not be allowed to grow back, but it is far from the first development in the region. This issue is a complicated one. If the residents of Maine don't want that corridor, they have the right to refuse it. But when they're being propagandized to on two sides from different groups of energy companies fighting to win the lucrative right to provide state energy, it makes it difficult to discern which side to take. I haven't even touched on the complicated history of how this corridor was approved, the existing environmental impact of fossil fuels, and all sorts of issues that the Tucker Carlson program only pretends to address. This isn't a simple story about a forest being cut down by an evil energy company. It's a story about two energy industries and the impact they have on the environment and the communities within it. There is a deeper message to this program.
This corridor is more than an energy project. It's an attack against rural America and the people who live there.
With that delivery of a dose of fear, there's the bonus effect of contributing to the propaganda effort of fossil fuel companies. These programs aren't just about scaring people. What makes them so deceptive is the underlying purpose of these scare tactics. Another issue that seems to affect people at their most basic level is the sudden drop in sperm count and testosterone in men. This was the subject of the much discussed The End of Men episode. This one is about a lot more than the memorable image of a naked man standing in front of a red light projector. But I won't tease your balls any further, so let's answer one question right away. Does red light therapy raise your testosterone? The short answer is no. But let's give this a bit more detail. The research cited in the program is from 1939 and refers to red light therapy, which is more commonly associated with research done in 1967 by Hungarian physician André Mester. Since then, there has been research done on red light therapy showing potential treatment for pain relief, acne treatment, blood circulation, asthma, and a few other illnesses. But, so far, there is no evidence that red light therapy has any impact on sperm count or testosterone, and the program itself only makes a passing reference to it, spending less than 2 minutes on tanning your balls. More importantly than this really funny image, the section of the program is pushing something called bro science, also sometimes called bromeopathy. Those are actually names they use, I'm not making that up.
The bro science behind ball tanning is generally that it feels good, so do it.
So the reason these guys are shining a light on their balls is because it feels good, which is totally fine. I'm not here to kink shame anyone, but that doesn't mean you should be telling people it affects testosterone levels. And let's back up and talk about bro science for a moment.
There's a growing movement of Americans who are looking affirmatively for ways to get healthy, to balance their hormones, to regain their fertility. Effectively, they're experimenting on themselves and they're sharing the results online. They call themselves bro scientists, half jokingly.
As you might have guessed, none of this is actually science. The findings of these bros aren't published in any sort of peer-reviewed journal. They're just put onto social media or in books. And none of these bros seem to have any credentials to speak to any of the topics they touch on. But because of their physiques, it's taken as a given that they must know what they're talking about. Some of the advice they give is fine, like getting regular exercise, but the decent advice they give is pretty common knowledge that you don't need a beefy man to tell you. The program's highlights, rather, are these images of muscular bodies and messages about nationalism, hence an interview with the guy called the Raw Egg Nationalist.
The enemy today is what I like to call soy globalism. The globalist aim is to destroy nations and local communities, and they do this by isolating communities and sickening them through food, and also through so-called medicine, and all the dreadful chemicals we're exposed to on a daily basis.
I'm not exactly sure what soy globalism is supposed to be, aside from a conspiracy theory with anti-Semitic undertones, but apparently it can only be stopped by guys lifting weights and drinking raw eggs. And while the program doesn't try and say that the globalists will be defeated by the ability to lift heavy things, it does suggest that these are means to raise testosterone and sperm levels, and that will somehow fight the globalists. Even though he's heavily featured in this program, it's hard to get a firm grasp on what the Raw Egg Nationalist is really about, so I found an interview he did with the supposedly changed but actually still a garbage person at heart, Lauren Southern.
This paper, which is called Bread and Other Edible Agents of Mental Disease. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting paper that discusses the interrelationship between wheat consumption and mental illness.
If you're wondering why you've never heard of this hypothesis of bread causing mental health issues, that's because it isn't true. The Raw Egg Nationalist uses embarrassingly bad evidence, such as referring to a famine in 1940 leading to a drop of mental health issues, apparently unaware that a famine is an obvious confound to that conclusion, and that the mental diagnoses in 1940 were perhaps not comparable to the present day. There's an article linked below that goes into further detail about why this thought that bread somehow impacts mental health is nonsense. And in this interview, he repeats something that's pounded home again and again in the Carlson program.
If it continues unchecked, then one of the principal effects will be that all men are infertile. So there's some rather shocking statistics.
You can do the math. We're headed for a calamity. And that's not hyperbole, it's not exaggeration, it's just a mathematical fact.
For those curious, the raspy voice guy is Robert Kennedy, noted crank whose anti-vax crusade has lasted decades. He's opposed everything from 5G to ultrasounds, and is the last person you would want to trust on medical advice. The truth here is less alarming and more complicated than the end of men makes it out to be. One fact that isn't really disputed is that sperm counts probably have been falling for the last 40 years. The average sperm count for an adult male has gone from 99 million sperm per milliliter to 47 million sperm per milliliter. While that might sound alarming at first, it should be noted that this is still well within healthy parameters. A man is only considered to have a low sperm count if it's under the 15 million sperm per milliliter. While a lower average means that more men will be falling under this mark, the fact that the average is still so high means that number isn't really a high enough cause for concern that the species will be sterile in 20 years. It's hypothesized that causes of lower sperm might be related to obesity or certain chemicals found in plastics that are making their way into our bodies, and all of this makes a compelling case for a problem that the end of men is highlighting. But this is the subtle genius of some of Tucker Carlson's work. He can take a real problem and sometimes point toward genuine causes, but his solutions are ridiculous and often towards ends that have nothing to do with them. When the trailer for The End of Men first appeared, I wrote a few notes, and here's one I jotted down presented verbatim. The fact he's doing something to look so silly is to trigger the media into attacking him.
No one in Washington seems interested at all in why testosterone levels are dropping. It's a joke to them. Just watch their reaction to the preview of this episode.
I gotta say, coming from a Fox News anchor, that is a refreshing and positive celebration of homoeroticism. Good for you, fellas. Good for you.
Why are they all naked? This doesn't make any sense.
Okay, this trip into Tuckham's dreamscape is absurd. I mean, testicle tanning?
You can't watch that and not see how homoerotic it is.
Some pretty blatant fascist posturing.
So if men want to stay male, they must be fascists, and also gay. That's what the media tells you.
First off, muscular men grappling each other is definitely homoerotic, and it's imagery that has a long tradition in gay art. Second though, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And it doesn't make someone gay if they enjoy it. Millions of people watch professional wrestling, and it doesn't make them or the performers gay. And even if they were, so what? People on the left shouldn't be using the idea that someone is gay as an insult. All these clips are used as fodder by Carlson though, stripped of any meaningful critique, so Tucker can twist people's understanding of the people who oppose him into nonsense. Tucker Carlson is bouncing off the mockery to avoid real observations being made, that this special is trying to smuggle in fascism with its talk about sperm and testosterone. And this pushback against it is to create the illusion of persecution. The trailer made use of this particular slogan.
Those hard times inevitably produce men who are tough, men who are resourceful, men who are strong enough to survive. And then they go on to re-establish order, and so the cycle begins again.
This slogan is a popular meme amongst the far right and has no real basis in history. It's usually a thinly veiled attempt at saying a dictator of some kind is needed to take control of a country. Tucker Carlson's program ties to something a bit grander sounding.
The Greeks called this anacyclosis, the life cycle of any society. In a golden age, heroic leaders pursued transcendent goals, something bigger than themselves. They overcome challenge after challenge, and then they win. Then, surrounded by the wealth and the comfort they have won, they lose their life force. They become confused and isolated, they lose faith in themselves, and the civilization they've created begins to decline.
The cycle Carlson is referring to looks like this. We are supposedly in ochlocracy, the feeble state collapsing into mob rule, and we are in desperate need for strong men to rise up and take control. In other words, a new monarchy. Tucker Carlson isn't particularly consistent in this analysis in his other programs, as he'll describe the tyranny of the Biden administration or the oligarchs secretly running things, but the messaging does remain the same, and it's reinforced by the whole point of this program, pushing this idea that a strong man, or small group of strong men, must take control of the nation. This is a direct call for autocracy. And as we'll see as we move through these specials, there is a vested interest in proposing fascism as a new solution to these imagined problems. First, by frightening the audience and leading them into the arms of the strong men who will save them. Fear doesn't just come in the shape of faceless corporations with their green energy projects or a vague understanding of declining sperm rates, though. Much fear is brewed when talking about dangerous groups of people. In the episode Surviving Disorder, there is a deliberate misreading of history of what the program calls race riots.
In 2020, race riots erupted again, but this time was different. Political leaders have become even more brazen about encouraging disorder and eliminating the right of citizens to defend themselves.
This is, of course, in response to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations of 2020. Although most of them were peaceful, Carlson would rather present them as race riots. In Surviving Disorder, the history of these supposed riots doesn't begin where you might expect, with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but instead the program chooses to start in the early 90s when violence erupted after footage of Rodney King being beaten by a group of policemen sparked outrage. Here's how that part of the story is discussed in the program.
Riots broke out after a jury acquitted 4 Los Angeles police officers involved in the arrest of Rodney King.
What the police were acquitted of is never mentioned. Why Black Americans in Los Angeles were so angry is never explored. And instead, this whole story is told in the context of out-of-control crime. The historical record of brutal policing and harsh treatment of a community isn't downplayed, it's flat-out ignored. As a quick example, Korean-American store owner David Ju is interviewed explaining how he had to defend his store from looting.
So I packed some, guns, rifles and shotguns and handguns.
Absent from this section is the story of Latasha Harlins, a 15-year-old girl who was shot by a Korean-American store owner named Soon Ja-do. When Do's expected 10-year prison sentence instead turned into 5 years probation, 400 hours of community service, a $500 restitution to the Harlins family, and paying for funeral expenses, it added to the same outrage that the beating of Rodney King did. Sadly, that outrage was misplaced towards Korean Americans who otherwise had nothing to do with the sentence. And while I'm not going to excuse the targeting of these businesses, understanding why that violence happened, the general impression that the legal system has no regard for Black Americans, should at least be acknowledged. But instead of any of that history, we hear about the guns Ju used to defend his store. The program jumps forward a few years to talk about Hurricane Katrina. Once again, we're greeted with footage of Black Americans being branded looters. There were, of course, people of all races grabbing as many supplies they could to survive during a hurricane, with a relief effort that was famously bungled by the Bush administration. Anyone around at that time might remember these infamous photo captions where a young Black man was called a looter and a white couple was described as simply having found supplies. The choice of footage in Surviving Disorder is very clearly meant to evoke looting by exclusively presenting Black Americans. We'd meet one white resident of New Orleans, a man named Vincent Purville, who is credited with starting a militia to protect his community following the hurricane.
The police car was coming down the street, the opposite direction. I said, "Sir, they just took my van, hit me in the head and stole my van." He said, "No problem, I'll take care of it." And he hauled and he took off the opposite direction.
Purville was forced to defend his home and himself.
For their willingness to defend themselves, he and his neighbors were denounced as racist by the news media.
The program makes this guy out to be a brave hero who had to scare off looters with his gun. The charge of racism that Carlson briefly mentions is a subtle reminder that the audience is meant to think of the supposed looters as Black, and that the media reflexively defends Black people regardless of anything. A.C. Thompson, a journalist writing for ProPublica, found something a bit different in his own investigation. This audio is from an interview he did with NPR.
I uncovered in my investigation was, while the group said that they were out to stop looters, if you interviewed the people who are on the other side of the guns, what you found out was that African-American males who apparently had committed no crimes were being targeted, attacked, threatened, and shot. And one vigilante told me the people who were coming into the area were hoodlums from the lower Ninth Ward, and you could look in their eyes and tell they were outlaws. Victims of the shootings say that they were the victims of racial epithets and that the N-word was thrown out at them when they were attacked.
Here's a quick anecdote that Purville gives the Tucker Carlson crew.
And one night we heard rustling, the cans were moving, and I said, "Who's there?" I didn't hear anything. I said, "I'm going to count to 3 and then I'm going to shoot." I said, 1, 2, and they said, "No, don't shoot, don't shoot." Never saw him, but I heard him running out that way.
The article Thompson wrote, in which he interviewed Purvell for, gives us a different perspective of the actions of Purvell, though. Purvell remembers aiming a shotgun at a random African-American man walking by his home, even though he knew the man had no connection to the theft of his vehicle. "I don't want you passing by my house," Purvell says he shouted out. Reggie Bell, 39, the African-American man Purvell confronted at gunpoint as he walked by Purvell's house. At the time, Bell, a cook, lived just a few blocks down the street from Purvell. In Bell's recollection, Purvell, standing with another gun-toting man, demanded to know what Bell was doing in Algiers Point. "I live here," Bell replied. "I can show you mail." That answer didn't appease the gunman, he says. According to Bell, Purvell told him, "Well, we don't want you around here. You loot, we shoot." In a later interview, Purvell admits he confronted Bell with a shotgun, but portrays the incident as a minor misunderstanding, saying he's since apologized to Bell. The article also notes that 4 people were killed while the militia was operating, and there was no police investigation of any of it. Next, we have a discussion about the Black Lives Matter demonstrations of 2020 and the very messy case of the killing of James Scurlock. The Carlson program goes to great lengths to present every fact it can to frame Scurlock as a dangerous criminal, while Gardner is presented as a victim by tearful friends. The actual facts of this case are difficult to sort, since Gardner took his own life before his case went to trial, but on its face it seems like it could have been an act of self-defense, or it could have been an armed man who started an altercation that spun out of control. The complexity of this case isn't what matters to Tucker Carlson and his team, though. Scurlock was black and Gardner was white. That's all they really needed to decide which side they were on. The pattern at this point should be crystal clear. This program is saying that there is a violent element in America, and it is predominantly black people, and that perhaps, sometimes Americans, usually white Americans, need to take that matter into their own hands to defend themselves. The same message is reinforced by another episode, the trial of Kyle, about Kyle Rittenhouse. This case has been talked about incessantly on YouTube, so I'm only going to pull out a few relevant sections.
Anarcho-tyranny, you may have heard the term. Here's the most straightforward definition. It means anarchy for the people in charge, tyranny for the population.
The use of this term is very much a callback to the idea that hard times are here via anacyclosis. It's used to frame the idea that the elites have given up prosecuting major crimes and instead prosecute petty ones to create chaos.
First, the media blast false propaganda to incite violence. Then the criminals are let loose, and leftist nonprofit groups are activated. Meanwhile, the state abdicates its responsibility to stop the chaos, to enforce order. And then self-defense is framed as murder.
It'd be pretty compelling if there was a single shred of evidence to support this narrative. You would think a cop would come forward to reveal that the police have been ordered to ignore enforcing the law during the summer of 2020, when instead over 14,000 people were arrested. And of course there are allusions to Soviet Russia, because why not?
The show trials of the Soviet Union were not televised. Zinoviev never made cable news. But the Soviet style of prosecution re-emerged when Kyle Rittenhouse went on trial.
And we all know how this story ends. Kyle Rittenhouse was found innocent. How exactly is this tyranny? A tyrannical government used the full weight of its power working with the media to go after Rittenhouse, only to completely bungle it at the very end. It's a strange lapse in competency in what would otherwise be a highly functioning conspiracy machine. Or perhaps the much easier answer is that there is no secret conspiracy at all. But Kyle Rittenhouse is irrelevant to the bigger picture here. Regardless of the outcome of the trial, this program would have made him to be the only victim, so it can leave its audience with this message.
He'll never be able to erase the slander and stigma laid on him by the media and by his prosecution. Those are the consequences of the trial of Kyle. The next time, it could be you.
Once again, it's fear that's being sold here, or urging people to pick up a gun to defend themselves from the threat, although in this case the people killed weren't black, but merely showing solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Before moving on, I do want to go back to that phrase of anarcho-tyranny, because it's important to note that this term was invented by a man named Samuel Francis, a columnist for the Washington Times. If you haven't heard of him before, and it's possible you haven't since he died in 2005, here's an example of some of his writing. If whites wanted to do so, they could dictate a solution to the racial problem tomorrow by curtailing immigration and sealing the border, by imposing adequate fertility controls on non-whites and encouraging a higher white birth rate, by refusing to be bullied into enduring multiculturalism, affirmative action, civil rights laws and policies, and by refusing to submit to cultural dissolution, interracial violence and insults, and the guilt that multiracialists inculcate. Sam Francis is a white nationalist, and Tucker Carlson citing his term is not an accident. 3 former Fox employees have reported that Carlson's regular news show uses minute-by-minute ratings data to track the stories that resonate most with his audience. White nationalist stories, such as the Great Replacement conspiracy, tend to be the most popular. Back in 2020, it was also revealed that one of Tucker Carlson's head writers was regularly posting on a white nationalist message board, so it's not surprising that, for his most devoted viewers, Carlson quite happily cites white nationalists such as Samuel Francis. The series presents being the average white American as a scary thing, besieged on all sides so that you might need to arm yourself. There's even an episode that's basically a 20-minute commercial for the AR-15. Not all supposed dangers are violent ones, though. One two-parter in particular highlights another group that is supposedly threatening average Americans. It's titled Transgressive, the Cult of Confusion, and it targets trans people. They are immediately labeled as a cult, pushed by every institution.
The transgender phenomenon is not a small-scale operation. It's not led by a single man. Instead, it's led by the most influential power centers in the country. Our own government, big corporations, the medical institutions, and of course the mass media.
This two-parter is pretty dull for anyone familiar with the usual anti-trans talking points. It dusts off old favorites such as children being supposedly groomed to complaining about not being able to criticize trans people.
Even acknowledging that any of this is happening will get you canceled, kicked off social media. You can be fired from your job. It may even be punishable by law. Criticism of the transgender movement is not allowed.
It's rich hearing the most watched host on cable news saying this on one of his 3 programs. It's even more ridiculous considering the number of governments around the world banning gender-affirming care for people of all ages. The fact that society has progressed to the point where some people and a few institutions tolerate trans people, not actively shaming them and forcing them into torturous conversion therapy, only seems like an unfair privilege if the assumption is that trans people should be persecuted. Which is part of the reason why this program also supports conversion therapy.
Proposals are on the books by activists to expand the meaning of conversion therapy. These laws would make it illegal for any religious or therapeutic practice to take any approach other than complete affirmation. That would include in sermons, in counseling, in prayer, or perhaps most telling, in exorcism.
Conversion therapy, which, by the way, has been performed on members of the LGBT community for decades, has been described as a form of torture by the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims. The trans bigotry seen here is completely impervious to facts. Carlson just casually drops things like this.
No research has ever shown that gender-affirmative care, hormone therapy, or cross-sex surgery reduces the risk of suicide or indeed improves mental health outcomes of any kind over the long term.
Obviously not true. I've linked a few examples of research supporting gender-affirming care below, and gender-affirming care is supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the Endocrine Society, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Psychiatric Association. Carlson's sly little use of long-term is a common refrain from anyone trying to undermine new medical treatments. It's been used in the past for everything from vaccines to laser eye surgery. Carlson doesn't explain what long-term danger there should be, aside from the vague idea that younger people will grow out of it. Though if he really believed kids were growing out of it, he wouldn't be pushing conversion therapy as a necessary intervention, which would effectively just torture it out of them, or at least torture them long enough that they can pretend that they aren't trans. But this two-parter is not about genuinely debating the scientific literature. Its primary goal is to scare people into believing that their children are being brainwashed by the trans community through social media or somehow through hypnosis tapes.
One glitter family composed of several older male-to-female groomers sent this hypnosis audio tape to a 13-year-old boy. They told him to listen to it as he was falling asleep.
You're a strong, beautiful, talented woman.
I'm not sure what's more ridiculous, the idea that trans people are somehow forcing kids to listen to these tapes, or that a 13-year-old is using cassette tapes at all. Of course, we're given no additional information about this supposed event that really truly happened. We just have to take Tucker Carlson's word on it. The one serious section of the two-parter delves into people who detransition, who are a favorite of anti-trans groups. These people are a small minority of trans people, with the highest measure being a US survey in 2015 that had it at 8%. The majority of this 8% cited not their own feelings of gender causing them to detransition, but rather social stigma or a lack of access to care. The actual number of people who detransition on their is often measured anywhere from 0.5 to 2% of all trans people. That being said, people who detransition do exist, and their care should be considered as part of gender-affirming care. It's not an argument to ban gender-affirming care, but rather to improve it. Although several people who have detransitioned are interviewed, the two-parter doesn't speak to a single trans person about the impact gender-affirming care has had on them. That's a side of the story that these programs simply aren't interested in. As I mentioned earlier, the reason Tucker and this program talk about trans people as if they're all powerful is that people like him no longer have the power to grind them into the dust. I'm certainly not the first person to notice this, but it is worth repeating that, for very privileged people, the loss of that privilege, even a minor one, can feel like oppression. It also helps create the illusion of a perceived threat. Trans people, immigrants, black people, and others are having their very existence politicized as an existential threat to the greater population. And Tucker Carlson knows he's doing this. In an episode of Tucker Carlson Originals about China's presence in Brazil, Carlson drops this line.
As American domestic politics has been dominated by micro issues like George Floyd and trans rights, the Chinese government has been busy taking over the world.
The reason these issues have come up is because Tucker Carlson and his ilk have been demonizing these groups. If he doesn't want to talk about these issues, he could just stop spreading misinformation about them. But he needs to create fear about Americans trying to live their lives free of state oppression, and subtly suggest that Americans not in these groups might need to use violence to defend themselves. This series isn't just about pointing out which groups to fear, though. It also highlights a group that people are expected to trust and obey. The series presents cops in a few ways. Sometimes they're the faceless goons collecting guns on behalf of the government. Other times they're the brave people standing against the nefarious groups that threaten Americans. What this series is trying to say is that there is good policing and bad policing. And the good kind of policing is apparently the one that is typically turned against specific groups of people who have been labeled as threats. One of those groups is undocumented immigrants. At first, this is presented through a look at MS-13 in the program titled Hunting MS-13. MS-13 was founded in Los Angeles, which the program helpfully points out, though this is quickly glossed over to instead talk about immigration policy, specifically criticizing Democrats for their role in supposedly opening borders. Even though the gang began in the US, immigration is still blamed as what's fueling its growth and influence. The politics are pretty standard right-wing Republican attacks, but what's interesting is how he describes El Salvador and how policing supposedly works there.
Salvadorans elected a new president called Nayib Bukele. Bukele pledged to crack down on MS-13 with total ferocity. He kept that promise, and the murder rate dropped dramatically. The first thing you notice about El Salvador is how many men in uniforms there are in public carrying guns. They're everywhere, standing in front of businesses, guarding restaurants and hotels. Military units patrol public plazas.
This is part of a glowing assessment of the current president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele. Bukele insists that the police presence is what's caused the murder rate to plummet in El Salvador, though it has been alleged that, rather than the police presence, it's that Bukele's government has been negotiating with the gangs to get violence down, offering them material compensation. Tucker Carlson mentions that himself.
One of the questions we're going to ask the president, maybe the first one, is what is it like to preside over a country where an armed criminal gang like MS-13 is so powerful that the government actually negotiates with it?
And then he doesn't ask Bukele about it. Or if he did ask him, he didn't share Bukele's response in the program. This program isn't really about El Salvador aside from fawning over its police state. Rather, it's just presenting this as a model of sorts as a response to gang violence. And it's trying to tie this type of violence to immigration. And by immigrants, it's not trying to isolate a specific dangerous group within the immigrant population. It extends that label to all of them.
Thanks to America's policy of leaving its borders open, gang violence in El Salvador inevitably moves northward to the United States.
Immigrant-dense parts of Virginia, California, North Carolina, and New York have become bases of operation for
these. These are your landscapers, they work in the wineries, the potato fields. A lot of them work in restaurants. They're your dishwashers, the guys that are prepping the food in the back.
13 gang members participated in that killing. At least 7 of them came here illegally. They were classified as unaccompanied minors when they arrived.
So if an undocumented immigrant is working as a day laborer, perhaps one of the most common jobs they take, or if they're an unaccompanied minor, they should all be considered as potential gang members and viewed with suspicion and fear. Of course, it's a sad fact that Any child can fall in with a gang, and some people in gangs occasionally work other jobs outside of their gang activities, but none of this is exclusive to immigrants. In a 2022 research paper by Daniel Scott, an assistant professor at Texas A&M, he reviewed some of the literature related to gang violence and gang migration. Here's an excerpt that concludes the section on immigration. When examining gang crime specifically, there is no significant association with Latino immigration. These findings suggest that even though gangs and gang involvement increase the likelihood of violence, the presence of immigrants may aid in reducing this probability of gang violence. Much like everything else covered by Tucker Carlson, this isn't about informing the audience, but instead scaring them. When Tucker visits a prison in El Salvador, here is the scene that greets him on the inside. And the program leaves off on an ominous note that these violent gang members want to invade the United States.
Every single member of MS-13 we spoke to behind bars said that upon release they're planning to come to America immediately, legally or not.
This baton is picked up 2 episodes later in an episode called The Illegal Invasion, and you better believe this opens up with people being terrified.
People are afraid in their own homes right now. People are afraid in their own yards.
And I never leave home without a pistol in my pocket and a dog on my side.
None of our family feels safe leaving the house without a gun.
This is America. We shouldn't have to live in fear in our own house.
And who are people supposed to be afraid of?
¿De dónde son? Ghana. Ghana. You're from Ghana.
Immigrants. Not just from Central or South America, but also people from Africa. I'm pretty sure this racial coding pattern has gotten pretty obvious by now. The program is a bit more specific when it highlights a small town in Texas that has beefed up its police in an effort to chase down undocumented immigrants. The program presents the picture of a community pushed to its limit, with citizens forced to patrol their own property while the police are stretched thin chasing down people who have illegally crossed the border. We see a few clips of people being arrested by police who then bemoan the lack of federal support for their important crusade.
Where's our federal government? Nobody's helping us out. Texas is defending themselves out here. They should be out here helping us.
And the mayor blames crime in the town on immigrants who have entered the country illegally.
Our crime's up, our car break-ins are up, our house burglaries are up.
Even though the town is 78% Hispanic, the only non-law enforcement citizens interviewed are white, and the only Hispanic people interviewed are cops. There's also this one really gross scene where someone who suspects some random trash on their property was touched by people who illegally crossed the border, so she lights it on fire because she's afraid it's now diseased.
We don't know where this stuff came from, what kind of diseases, bacteria it might have, so what other choice do I have other than to light it on fire?
So we're presented with the picture of a Texas border town that heavily arms its police to protect itself from a surge of illegal immigration. This town, by the way, is Uvalde, Texas. This episode aired nearly 1 year before the tragedy in Uvalde where 19 children were murdered at Robb Elementary. It's strange to be watching it after the fact, knowing that these police who are being presented as brave heroes fighting supposed criminals would become absolute cowards and liars when their incompetence worsened one of the worst mass shootings in 2022 so far. Most disturbing though is this brief clip where School District Police Chief Pedro Arredondo is shown springing into action, demonstrating how schools are secured by police.
Secure modes sometimes happen weekly, sometimes they happen twice a day sometimes.
Chief walked us through the process of putting Uvalde High School into what they call secure mode. It happens every time there's a high-speed chase through town.
In a secure mode, every door is locked, everybody comes in, we grab all the students that are on the outside or any visitors and bring them inside, and they go into a locked position. Once the doors are locked, no one comes in and out, period.
Arredondo, who was supposedly in charge of the response during the shooting, waited over 1 hour before confronting the shooter, while children were calling 911 asking for help. Here's how Carlson's program presents the cops springing to action to arrest someone.
¿Qué me ves sus manos? Salte para acá. Salte. Vamos. Vamos. Policía.
These police are very good at arresting this tired old guy from Honduras, but when it comes to an active shooter in an elementary school, they're not quite so energetic. Of course, far be it from me not to spread the blame around. There were police from many levels of government who failed those children, so it's not just on the Uvalde Police Department. But for the purposes of this video, I need to stress that the accounts of police are taken completely uncritically by Tucker Carlson's crew. This program is there to blame the Democratic Party for its failures along the border and to present the cops as these put-upon victims of those policies, willing to believe anything that fits that narrative. The lesson to learn from all of this would be that police shouldn't be blindly trusted to keep you safe or tell you the truth, and that it's the job of the media to hold them accountable. But those aren't the goals of Tucker Carlson's program. The only thing he's here to do is create fear and portray the only solution, aside from drinking raw eggs, is to trust a powerful police state. It shouldn't take 19 dead children for a journalist to question the police. Another target for these programs are progressive district attorneys in Chicago and Los Angeles. Tucker Carlson Originals began its run with the special Chicago in Crisis, and then began its second season with Suicide of Los Angeles. Both programs have essentially the same thesis, that recently elected Kim Foxx in Chicago and George Gascon in Los Angeles are destroying their respective cities. This follows the frequent talking points that cities run by Democratic politicians are being swept up in a crime wave that began in 2020. This is done, naturally, by stoking fear.
This isn't random violence.
Good evening.
It's the consequence of bad policy brought to Chicago by Cook County prosecutor Kim Foxx. In just his first year in office, George Gascon turned Los Angeles County into a third world war zone.
These claims are evidenced by images and videos from a series of violent crimes, none with any context, but presumably from the time and place where the district attorneys were currently serving, as if their election triggered a crime wave in their respective cities. The closest evidence of that we get is one man who was arrested expressing happiness that he might get a lighter sentence because of the recent election of Gascon.
Get that name on my face, that's a champ right there.
Otherwise, we see some cherry-picked stats that are attributed to two DAs who have respectively had 6 and 2 years serving in their current positions.
Shootings last year up 13%, and homicides citywide up nearly 12%.
What these programs miss completely is that crime rates have gone up across the United States, and this is a trend that has been happening in every city, not just those with progressive district attorneys. A more careful look at the stats also reveals that violent crime hasn't been rising across all categories. While murder and aggravated assault are both up, robbery and rape are both down, and while the programs specifically decry murder rates in Chicago and Los Angeles, they aren't exceptions, but rather consistent across a number of American cities, regardless of the political party in power within them. Also important is that while crime has overall gone up, it's simply not true when Tucker Carlson makes claims such as,
in 2020, violent crime in Los Angeles, California reached a level and an intensity that virtually no one who lives there had ever seen.
By virtually no one, I assume he means anyone who was alive 10 years ago when the violent crime rate in Los Angeles was just as high. Or perhaps he means 20 years ago when the violent crime rate was twice as high. Or maybe 30 years ago when the violent crime rate was 3 times as high. And for whatever value actual data might have in this conversation, violent crime is actually down this year in Chicago. It's a deceptive use of statistics to exaggerate a problem for political gain. In this way, Tucker Carlson's program isn't much different from standard political propaganda. Find a news story and frame it in a way that blames the opposition party, but there's something more interesting going on here. Notably, lines like these ones.
Kim Foxx was elected with more than $2 million in cash from billionaire George Soros.
And the one for George Gascon is even more explicit.
George Soros, who has been bankrolling progressive DAs all across the entire country.
It builds to summaries like these.
This is the path to civilizational collapse. George Gascon won't admit that his policies have failed, and in some ways they haven't failed at all, because the outcome is exactly what he wanted. These are people who revel in chaos, suffering, disorder, and destruction.
These progressive district attorneys aren't simply well-meaning people with policies that Carlson disagrees with. Rather, he portrays them as part of a much bigger plot, orchestrated by George Soros to collapse American civilization. The cops, at least those operating within a police state that aggressively chases down immigrants, are the good guys in these programs, and government officials that get in the way of the policing are the enemy, working at the behest of some kind of secret cabal. But as seen in El Salvador, not all governments are bad, particularly if they supposedly control their country with heavy policing and harsh prisons. These governments are presented as the bulwark against the threat of the George Soros cabal. George Soros comes up several times in this series, though never quite as prominently as he does in the ominously titled Hungary vs. Soros, The Fight for Civilization. Here's how the program describes George Soros.
Globalism.
liberalism, open borders. Soros is the man who stands for all that.
He represents everything which is not good for this country.
Although the episode is, in part, a fawning portrayal of Hungarian President Viktor Orbán, its other purpose is to reaffirm the narrative of George Soros as the billionaire pulling the strings behind anything the right has labeled a threat, from trans people to immigrants. Soros has been a target of the right for over 20 years, though none of the claims against him ever seem to have much in the way of evidence, from financing caravans of immigrants to rigging elections. In the case of Hungary, a €100 million PR push is blaming all of the ills of its country on George Soros. The origin of this campaign goes back to 2013 when Orbán solicited the help of Arthur Finkelstein, a political consultant who has worked for numerous Republican politicians including Donald Trump, George Bush Sr., Ronald Reagan, and Richard Nixon. Finkelstein's method was to focus on personalizing a perceived threat, so instead of the enemy being Al-Qaeda, he would consider it better to frame the threat as Osama bin Laden. A BBC article details the advice he gave to Orbán. Finkelstein realized the best way to get Orbán elected was to find a new enemy. He suggested Soros, and it was a perfect choice. Reporter Hans Grassiger says, "The very right hated him because he was Jewish. People at the very left hated him because he was a capitalist." Although Orbán's government has claimed to not have invented Soros as a boogeyman, it is noticeable that his attacks have some similarity to rants you would see coming from the US, such as seen on Bill O'Reilly before Tucker Carlson took over his time slot.
His organizations can raise millions for politicians who will do his bidding. Thus, he can demand that politicians running for office do what he tells them to do.
The attacks on Soros tend to rely on vague references to funding, often through his NGO, Open Societies Foundation, via any grants it may offer. Even when no line can be drawn to funding, Soros is still portrayed as controlling the media, local governments, and other groups, all using very anti-Semitic dog whistles. Here's an excerpt from a speech by Orbán. "We are fighting an enemy that is different from us, not open but hiding, not straightforward but crafty, not honest but unprincipled, not national but international, does not believe in working but speculates with money, does not have its own homeland but feels it owns the whole world." We can see Carlson himself get on the use of tropes by digging up the Puppet Master one.
Through Soros' network of non-governmental organizations, he spent billions trying to eliminate national borders, to oust democratically elected leaders, and install ideologically aligned puppets into positions of power.
In Tucker Carlson's program, when going over the various occupations of Hungary throughout history, there's one curious omission.
After World War I, the Trianon Treaty was imposed on them by the victorious Allies, which severed 2/3 of Greater Hungary away from the ethnic Hungarian part. And then, after World War II, they were occupied by the Soviets and ruled by the communists for another 40 years.
During the Nazi occupation of Hungary, nearly 1 million people died. Seems like that would at least be worth a mention. The program waves away charges of anti-Semitism by claiming the media is being controlled by Soros.
The media dutifully pushed George Soros' agenda on immigration and culture, while at the same time defending him from all criticism. They claim any attack on George Soros is anti-Semitic.
It's ironic, isn't it, that their claims against George Soros can't possibly be anti-Semitic because the media is being controlled to say that it's anti-Semitic, even though the idea behind media around the world being controlled by a shadowy cabal is a very old anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Something completely avoided here is that the reason we have so much coverage of the attacks on Soros isn't because of some sort of nefarious control of the media. I personally wouldn't place a high news value on protecting the reputation of a billionaire myself. The reason we got so much of this coverage in the late 2010s is because of a shooting at a Pittsburgh synagogue that killed 11 people and wounded 6 others. The gunman was obsessed with Soros-themed conspiracy theories. These conspiracy theories aren't just tools to win elections, they are being deployed specifically to target Jewish people, and Soros is the Jewish billionaire they're using as their figurehead. The fact that he's a billionaire shouldn't dissuade anyone, particularly those on the left, from calling out what this clearly is, and that's anti-Semitism. And it's worth mentioning that on the left, sometimes we can be a little slow in picking up on those signs. We can't pretend like these threats started with Kanye West or Donald Trump. They've been a fixture in the political scene for a very long time. Although Carlson will decry the media for uncritically believing things that come from NGOs, he seems completely willing to nod along to anything from the mouth of cops or far-right governments.
How many people are you now catching trying to come across your southern border?
From January, 50,000 people tried to make it to reach the territory of the European Union, but All of them were stopped by the fans and the whole system.
How many? Oh, all of them. You don't think any made it?
No, not at all.
Pretty great.
100% secure.
The program eventually devolves into hand-wringing about demographics changing, which is code for the Great Replacement theory, the idea that white people are deliberately being replaced in the West by a nefarious globalist conspiracy, which reinforces how white nationalism ties into all of this. Writing for Politico, Hungarian journalist Victoria Zsudot gave her own impression of this Tucker Carlson Originals episode, saying, "I've watched since 2010 as Orbán, an ally of Donald Trump and Fox News favorite, has modified election laws to favor his party, curbed freedom of the press, leading me to lose my job more than once, cozied up to Russia and China, passed anti-LGBTQ laws, and waged a war against migration. All the while, George Soros has been a convenient boogeyman. The government has plastered the billionaire's face on billboards across the country, and Orbán's party quite literally named its draconian 2018 anti-immigration bill the Stop Soros Law." Zsudot goes into detail about how this fear-mongering about George Soros is old news for the people of Hungary, and this special is better suited as a PR victory for Orbán, and a chance to remain on good terms with the American right. It's a great article that offers a lot of details, definitely give it a read. It's linked below. For an American audience less familiar with this tactic, it's the anti-Semitic Soros conspiracy theory that's invigorated by specials like this one. This cozying up to far-right leaders was also seen in the program titled The China Takeover Brazil, which serves as a fawning portrayal of Jair Bolsonaro. It's a bit more sophisticated as it ropes in Chinese influence in the region instead of relying on a conspiracy theory, since it's at least true that China is investing in Brazil. But it overplays its hand by revealing its concern over Chinese influence is not centered on the well-being of the Brazilian people, but rather protecting the interests of American hegemony in the region. That doesn't stop Florida Senator Marco Rubio from roping in a bit of the globalist fear-mongering for good measure, though.
Spreading some globalist ideology on as many countries as possible at the expense of the interest of Americans, American workers, and our national security.
This special, much like the puffing up of Orbán, aired shortly before a federal election in each of their respective countries. That timing probably isn't a coincidence. Much of the Tucker Carlson Originals programs fit into an easily understood framework of creating fear, finding scapegoats, using conspiracy theories, and endorsing authoritarian police states. Some programs even do more than one of those. But there are a few examples of programs that defy these classifications. In this final category, there are only 3 episodes that really fit into it, with 2 looking at aliens and the other being a fawning profile of Kid Rock. The 2 episodes on aliens are very weird. The first focuses on UFOs and the second on cattle mutilations, all leaning very heavily into the idea that you can't trust the government and that aliens are probably out there.
We showed them the images of the mutilated animals.
What was the first thing that went through your head when you saw that?
Aliens.
I wanted to get a perspective into this that's a bit more informed on alien claims, so I asked my friends Tristan and Scott from the It's Probably Not Aliens podcast for some insights into some of the claims made in these programs.
As we've done on the show a lot, we've noticed that there is a weirdly significant amount of crossover between far-right identity or far-right politics and sort of more esoteric stuff like UFO stuff. The most useful statistic I've ever heard is that the best signal that someone is going to believe in a conspiracy theory is believing in another conspiracy theory. And a lot of right-wing politics, especially far right-wing politics, is steeped in conspiracy.
It can start as simple as like cattle mutilation. It's got to be aliens. What else are aliens up to? And then you start getting into stuff like Ancient Aliens, which itself has a lot of undertones, and we've discussed this a lot of having like these sort of racist vibes about the show, where it's like these ancient peoples from societies that aren't, white, they could never have done it themselves, so it must have been aliens. And so you keep going down this like alien rabbit hole.
Yeah, there's almost like an innate distrust of authority that comes from conspiracy culture. And then a lot of the UFO subculture is built around the idea that the US is, or at least all governments are, suppressing knowledge about it in some capacity. So you could imagine that mindset would spread to those other areas as well. I'm not a government truster. I'm not like, oh yeah, blind trust the government on all things. But I will say that there are usually much more self-serving and small reasons for why they hide things or why they don't declassify things that are much more mundane. That also sucks because sometimes it is used for nefarious purposes, but not the kind of nefarious purposes that are that grand. Like there's a surprising amount of stuff that has to surround the war on terror that is redacted, but it mostly is because it belies like the sort of like absolutely no overview and like the rushed process that it went through to authorize things that would be defined as war crimes.
Something that I want to just touch on really quickly as well, or like to clarify, I don't think for the most part people who are fans of the show and who find the questions interesting, I don't think they're going into it being like, I like the show because it's racist. As soon as you get someone to question something, there's always a deeper rabbit hole for them to go down. You know, someone will be like, so what do you guys think? Do you think they landed on the moon? And then you'll get someone who's like, oh, so you think the moon is real? Interesting. Mm-hmm. There is that sort of connection of like that distrust of authority, both in like outright of being like, you know, the government's hiding aliens from you, but also just like experts in general, right? Where it'll be like mainstream archaeologists, people who actually study this stuff say it's one way. But, and this happens on the show all the time, it'll be like, but here's some guy who's like an English major to tell you about how this physics thing will work. It like throws off everyone with like an appeal to an authority where the person is not actually an authority on that specific subject, which is also frustrating.
I would say that conspiracy is the thing you go to when reality is getting further and further away from your politics, and you need to force reality back into whatever shape you want it to be.
Thanks to Scott and Tristan. Everyone go check out their podcast. The Kid Rock program in some ways feels the most unusual. It could easily be an episode of MTV's Cribs.
It is a redneck paradise. Behind his shooting range, he's got a second bass pond. This one has a golf green shaped like a guitar.
Kid Rock embarrasses himself by showing the world how he wastes his money on golden toilets or guitar-shaped golfing greens. And to show Carlson's audience that he's on their side, here's his car.
Owns dozens of cars, including a Let's Go Brandon edition Rolls-Royce.
And that's really the point here. Kid Rock is obviously not a man of the people this special desperately wants to present him as. He might complain about vaccines like the average Tucker Carlson viewer, but he literally poops on a golden toilet. His life is completely different. But by convincing his most loyal audience that yes, Kid Rock is just like them, Tucker Carlson is getting them to side with the wealthy. Wealthy people like himself, who was educated in exclusive private schools, grew up as an heir to a family fortune, and was given a number of privileges throughout his life. Tucker Carlson Originals use fear and paranoia to make people more comfortable with an authoritarian state, one that demonizes anyone who doesn't fit into the unit of a straight white Christian conservative family. Once in that unit, they are expected to cheer for American dominance abroad that enriches wealthy people, just like Tucker Carlson. The final image we see in the Kid Rock special is Kid Rock and Tucker Carlson holding up their fists, with Kid Rock's middle finger, I suppose, meaning some kind of defiance. A quick look at the wrist reveals watches that probably cost more than the average viewer makes in 3 months. Tucker Carlson is one of the elites he pretends to be fighting against, and Tucker Carlson Originals is a very depressing series that tries to reassure his most devoted audience members that he's one of them, and they should continue to live their lives in fear of various scapegoats while Carlson's allies create a fascist state. I'm a little worried I may have jumped the gun with this video because I'm pretty sure the second season of Tucker Carlson Originals isn't quite over yet. But the End of Men special seemed like a really good one to jump on, and I was a little worried that with even more episodes, there'd be even more things I wanted to respond to. That said, from what I have seen, they all seem to fit in that framework of helping build a fascist state. I'm sure a lot of regular viewers of this channel aren't surprised to find out that Tucker Carlson's project is to build a fascist state, but I think it's worth taking a look at just how he's doing that, and that would help us more effectively message against it. And hopefully this will save anyone the trouble of watching several hours worth of these just dreadful little programs. If you found any value in this at all and would like to contribute monetarily, you can become a patron and become like these lovely names you see sliding up the screen here. You'll also get early access to videos and a lot of fun extras that are only available to patrons. If you'd like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and leave a comment. Perhaps telling me about your favorite food? Sure, tell me what your favorite food is. That sounds fun. Thank you all so much for watching.